Okay, I'm Louise Jane, and I'm considered Woodward's resident historian. I wasn't born in Woodward. My husband and I moved here in 1977. The date of the tornado was April the 9th, 1947. It first touched down at White Deer, Texas, which is about 200 miles from here, at about 6:48 in the evening. It remained on the ground for the next 2 hours before it hit Woodward. It traveled at about 46 miles per hour and cut a path half a mile or so wide. It officially hit Woodward about 8:33 on April the 9th, 1947, coming from the southwest to the northeast part of the city. It devastated about 200 blocks of the city, and there eventually were about 100 people who died from the tornado injuries. There was absolutely no warning of the storm, because this is back before they gave tornado warnings. The devastation that the storm caused here in Woodward, it's hard to exaggerate. This was shortly after World War II. There were a lot of people, a lot of the doctors and medical people that came in who said it reminded them of the injuries that they saw during the war. That was the only thing to compare it to, was the bombing and the destruction of a war. The night of the storm, the city was plunged into darkness. The streets were littered with debris, and the early rescue crews had to be careful of down power lines, and also their vehicles tended to develop flat tires very soon because of all the nails and the debris that they ran over. The injured and dead were taken to what was then the city hospital. It's located on 5th Street, and it filled overflowing. People were in the halls. They were laying on the porch of the hospital. They were laying on the lawn in front of the hospital. Tornado victims were coated with mud, and that's the thing that people will tell you everyone you talk about, was the incredible amount of mud and dirt that the people had. I've talked to people that's what they did, was to go to the hospital and just wash the dirt off of the victims. Okay, 1947 seemed to have been a very strange year weather-wise, because the day following the tornado, it snowed here in Woodward. And most of the funerals which followed in the next 2 or 3 days, there was either snow or rain on the day of the funerals.
My name is Franklin Stetcher. I'm a native of Woodward County. I was in Woodward the night of the tornado, 1947. I was on duty in the funeral home when the storm hit, and to watch out the window, saw the devastation of the power lines that went down, causing sparks jumping down the street, and trees and boards and metal sheets flying everywhere. The building that I was in, the windows were blown out. The roof was raised and lowered back down about 12 inches off of its original position, and no sooner had the wind subsided, someone came in and said, "There's been a terrible wreck over here and we need an ambulance." Well, but we pried the doors open in the garage and went around the block to where the wreck was, and assuming that it was a wreck, picked up 2 or 3 people and drove out of the path of the tornado to the hospital, where we delivered our injured and told the hospital personnel that it looked like there might be more injured, to be ready, and went back to the funeral home. And by the time we got back to the funeral home, they began to carry in the dead. They were brought in by car, they were brought in by pickup, they brought in people's arms. They were, all the beds were full, and then they began to lay them on the floor, in the hallways, and any place that there was room to lay a body, their children, adults. Following the tornado, there was no lights, no water, no gas. Made it very difficult to do work. And soon after that time, didn't mean a whole lot, but one of the first things that I realized was a friend, a funeral director from Clinton, showed up and said, "Man, your town was blown away. You're going to have a lot of casualties, and I've come to help." Well, we did candles and flashlights and scoured the neighborhood and found a cistern where we could get a bucket of water, and he went to work. And as time went on, they were bringing in bodies, and the hospital was full. You couldn't take any more to the hospital. You make an ambulance run and you find someone who was dry in bed, you encourage them to stay there because it wasn't that good at the hospital, because it was a madhouse. And this friend of mine asked me if I knew a certain person in town. I said, yes. I said, that's his boy right there. And he said, well, that's my nephew. And I said, I'll take him next. And he proceeded to do the work embalming on his nephew. By morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, we took inventory of the funeral home. There were 66 bodies there. 10 of them were partially embalmed. We had, as I said, we had no lights, no water, no gas, and everyone was tired. Lord worked all night, and we were virtually down. And the telephones were on strike. We couldn't call anybody and for help, and very little help was there. So we got a hold of highway patrolman, and he radioed Oklahoma City, and they radioed the western half of Oklahoma saying they needed embalmers, and they didn't need modern equipment. They needed the old home-style equipment because of the facilities that were gone. And by 4 o'clock in the evening, there'd been a dozen embalmers there. The embalming was all done. The bodies that were there were covered with mud, and splinters and boards were just driven through them. And with the lack of water, people were we were unable to clean them the way they should be. So long underwear was placed on them, and hose socks were put on, white socks were put on, and they were put out in the chapel area for identification. When they were identified by the family, they were removed. Restoration work was completed. They were dressed, casketed, and put back in the chapel and the state room. Everybody had a private funeral. They were given all the respect that could possibly be. There was no mass burial. There was no mass graves. There were individual graves. The Mennonite group from Kansas moved into the cemetery in tents. All you needed to do was tell them where you wanted a grave, when you wanted it, and it would be ready. When the masses were buried, we had 2 girls in our establishment that were unclaimed and unidentified. and they soon drew our attention because of lack of identification. One appeared to be 12 years old in that neighborhood with relatively long hair, a girl who had the habit of chewing her fingernails. She was never identified. No one even inquired about her. The other little girl, 3 or 4 years old, we determined that several names was placed on her, as identified as a certain person. And when we got into it further, we found that this was one family. She lived with her grandmother, which was one name. Her mother was in Oklahoma City, unconscious, with another name. Her father was in Texas with another name. So the 3 names circulated around her, and so she was wrapped in a blanket and taken to the Moreland Hospital for her grandmother to identify. And the grandmother said, well, that looks like her, but I don't believe it's her. So she remained an unidentified girl, and approximately 3 or 4 weeks following the tornado, she and the 12-year-old were buried in Elmwood Cemetery. And that concludes that portion of my experience in the tornado.
I'm Ruth Bohn, and I was living in Woodward, Oklahoma in time of the tornado. And Joanne Croft was my niece. And when the tornado started at White Deer and ended up someplace north of Woodward, I raced up to the hospital to see what was going on. And my mother and my brother was there, and they took my mother to the Moreland Hospital. And then I rode back to go check on the rest of the relatives, and the nurse told me that, Betty Irvin told me that my 2 nieces was down there in the boiler room in the basement, and I went down, and both the children talked. One apparently had a hurt neck, and the other one had a piece of a 2x4, a little piece run through the soft part of her legs, and so I went on back over to the hospital with my mother, and I come back the next morning, and I went down, and little Joanne Croft was gone, and I went and asked Betty, I said, where is our little Joanne at? And said, well, 2 men dressed in khakis taken her, and said they were going to take her to another hospital, and they'd be right back in and get Jerry, and they never did return for her. And so then we started looking to see if maybe she had passed away or something, and we went to all the funeral homes, and we found one little bitty girl there that looked enough like her if she would been a little bit bigger to be a twin sister. But we cut the clothes and shoes and everything down there, and went to the rec house to get some clothes, which the funeral home wanted to test them for sizes, and the shoes didn't fit none of the clothing, so she just wasn't our little girl. She wasn't the right size. And we've been looking for her ever since, and hadn't found her. And in the process of trying to find the girls, why, we didn't have no lights or nothing, so we had to use candles, and Betty Irvin gave me a candle, the head nurse, and I went down into the basement beside the furnace and found the 2 girls. Talked to me and wanted to know about their daddy and mother, and I said, well, I don't know for sure about them, but I did find your daddy, and he's up in the Baker Hotel, that I haven't talked about your mother yet.
Did you know what had happened to the mother at that time?
Yes.
And what had happened?
She was dead, laying underneath the eave of the house. And somebody had stole her diamond off her hand.
Good Lord.
And her wristwatch.
You're on the air.
I'm Marvella Parks, and Joan Day Croft was my cousin. And at the time of the bad Woodward tornado, on April the 9th, 1947, I was 14 years old. But it's a terrible, horrible experience that one will never forget. And it will remain a mystery as to what has happened to Joan Gay Croft. She was a very sweet, beautiful, blonde-haired child. And my mother and I was searching for her after the tornado, and it was terribly dark. We had all kinds of weather and no lights. So my mother and I had a candle, and we went looking for Joan Gay, as well as other members of our family. And finally my mother took one of Joan Gay's frilly little dresses and her shoes, and we went to the funeral home and tried the dress and the shoes on her, and they did not begin to fit her at all in any way. So the only thing that I can remember basically is that her and her sister Jerry were laying in the basement together, and Joan Gay, they were visiting, and Joan Gay was crying, but she was not that terribly hurt, just a leg injury. And she was crying, and two men dressed in khaki uniforms or pants, clothing, came in and carried her out. And to this day, that was the last we had seen or heard from Joan Gay. We feel as a family that Joan Gay is out there somewhere in this world, and as family members and as the public, we would deeply like to find her, to know of her whereabouts and her welfare and how she is.
What were you talking about, mud?
Everybody was just covered with mud. Grown-ups, children, everybody. The moaning, the groaning, the crying. People were calling for their loved ones, family, and friends and neighbors, and everybody was trying to help everybody.
And both of the girls wanted us to take them home.
You did?
Uh-huh.
My
Well,
God.
they weren't hurt that bad. They flew, the next day they flew the oldest one, Jerry, to Oklahoma City, and she had a vertebrae kind of messed up in her neck, and she just stayed 1 day.
But they wanted to leave the hospital that night with you all.
Oh yeah, they were talking.
It was just a nightmare.
She was just
It's a nightmare, and I think she is out there, and with the public's help, I think possibly somebody might come up with some
and she was
information.
so Dutchy, she couldn't talk very good, she was...
Why don't you describe her a little bit for us?
Joan Gay was 4 years old. She was a very small build, very fair complected, most beautiful blonde hair, almost white. It was so blonde, it was almost white. Blue eyes, and very dainty, a very petite, very sweet little girl. And she always wore the little short frilly dresses, just looked like a little doll. She looked like a little baby doll. And she was very bashful, very bashful.
Well.
But she was a very pretty, beautiful little girl. That is greatly missed from her family.
And she had the prettiest little teeth you ever seen for a child.
She just had
those white teeth.
the prettiest skin to go with that pretty hair, and really bashful, and just a very pretty, dainty little